Good evening, my holy sisters and brothers. How are you? That was a Chabad Nigun sung by Barry Weber. How you doing this evening? Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we get into a dramatic tale from the days of the Holy Temple, a murder most foul. We'll be getting to that tonight here on Daf 23, Chaf Gimel, page 23 in Tractate Yoma. Who's with us this evening? Yehudit in South Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, James in Indianapolis, Paula in Chicago, Randy in Florida, Stephen in New Hampshire, Kat says shalom, Renee in Indy, Rebecca in LA, Gloria says shalom, Guy in Ohio, Tom in Myrtle Beach, Judith in Arizona, Carolyn in Raleigh, Ann in Merced, Paula from the Northwest, Moxie from West Virginia, John in Sedona, and everybody's greeting each other. Great to be with you. Our little bit of Torah before we get into our page of Talmud. Based, and it's going to come up today, but based, where is it? Right here. Based on a verse from Genesis 1:16. And God made the two luminaries, the greater luminary to rule the day, and the lesser luminary to rule the night, and the stars. So, of course, the Torah is speaking here about the sun and the moon. But there's a contradiction in the verse itself. First, it says that God made the two great luminaries. But then it refers to the sun as the great luminary that rules the day, and the moon as the lesser luminary. So is the moon a great luminary or a lesser luminary? You could say it's great, but not as great. But because there is this contradiction in the verse itself, our sages looked into the matter. And there's a very famous midrash about this. Originally, the sun and the moon were equal. They had an equal amount of light that they put out. But the moon said to the Holy One, blessed be He, how can two kings share a single crown? God said, well, now that you bring it up, so you be the lesser one. This is an example of the squeaky wheel didn't get the grease, the squeaky wheel got chucked off the wagon. But so the moon was immediately crestfallen. The moon could not be consoled. So then God offered some consolation to the moon. Said, listen, you're going to be the lesser luminary, but the sun will only be there in the daytime. The moon can appear both by day and night, but the moon was not consoled. So God said, well, when the Jewish people come into the world, the first commandment that's going to be given to them as a nation is that they will reckon their months, that they must count the new months from this time on, and that they'll have a holiday essentially every month, Rosh Chodesh, and it's going to be measured according to the moon. The calendar of the Jewish people is going to be according to the moon. And yet, the moon was not consoled. And so, wait a minute. And then God said, well, there's going to be righteous people who are going to be named after you. right? So anytime we have somebody who is called the small, and sometimes David was called the small, and Yaakov Avinu, our father Jacob, was called the small, and the prophet Samuel was called the small, and this honors the moon. And yet the moon would not be consoled. And then we have such a playful reading by the rabbis. So it says, with regard to the verse that ultimately would be in the Torah, that when there's a new moon and therefore a new month on the Jewish calendar, that we would bring a special offering, right? So it's a little bit of a holiday at the beginning of every month. And when the temple was standing, the Jews as a community, as a nation, had to bring a communal offering, the male goat, the he-goat of Rosh Chodesh. And it says in that verse that this will be an atonement unto the Lord. Now, this unto is different than what you would expect, which would be an atonement to the Lord, right? So this atonement unto the Lord, the sages actually read that where God is saying to the moon, what can I say? You complained. I had to deal with it. I made you smaller. Now that you're so sad, I feel a little bit bad about it. And so the atonement that the Jewish people bring at the beginning of the months will be an atonement for me, for God, as if God regrets making the moon smaller. But at any rate, we have this idea from the story that if the moon had been a little bit humbler at the outset and hadn't complained that, two are equal, maybe the moon should be greater, and instead the moon ended up getting diminished, right? Whereas the sun held his peace and ended up in the greater position. So one read of it is that because the moon complained and it sort of, didn't want to be in a second position or didn't want to be in an equal position, that the moon ended up in a second position. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe actually turns that all around. And the way the Rebbe hears this midrash is to say that God said to the moon, okay, so what you want is an opportunity to become greater. Okay. In order to do that, you first have to come down a peg. You have to be humbled first. But in being humbled, you actually will get an opportunity to become greater, right? The sun just stayed where it is. The sun didn't complain, but the sun didn't advance. The moon ended up becoming secondary to the sun in some ways, but the moon would get involved in the worship of the Jews. And the moon would have the opportunity to appear not only in the night, but also in the daytime. And when it's at night, well, then the moon gets billions and billions of friends as a cohort, since the stars would be with it. And so it's a great lesson. For us to grow, we often have to take a step back. We have to diminish ourselves a little bit. But from there, the opportunity, the potential for growth is born. All right, let's get into our page today, and we'll see how this midrash of the sun and the moon will play a part. We're starting at the bottom of the B side of page 22. We're talking here, we're in the second chapter and still discussing the first Mishna of Tractate Yoma, the sixth volume of the Talmud, the laws of Yom Kippur. We're generally speaking about the obligations of the high priest on Yom Kippur, and that during the 7 days of sequestering, he gets trained in all of the service that all the ordinary priests do during the week, because on Yom Kippur, the high priest will have to do just about all of it. Yesterday, we started to talk about who is sweeping out the ashes off the altar in the morning, which seems like it would be a very, mundane, kind of dirty task that none of the priests would want. But, of course, there's always an honor to perform any part of the divine service in the Holy Temple. And so the priests used to race up the altar to be the one that would perform that service, until once there was a race and one guy pushed the other. Unclear, did he do it on purpose so that he would win, or there was just kind of a narrow passage up the ramp and it was an accident? Either way, one of the priests broke his leg, and then the sages instituted that there would be a lottery instead of that race. Apropos of that discussion, we learned a little bit about Saul and David, both of whom had serious transgressions as king, but Saul was not able to atone for his transgression and lost the throne. David, although he suffered some very painful punishments, was able to make a successful atonement and retained his throne, and the dynasty would remain with the descendants of David forever. The throne of Israel would always belong to the descendants of King David. Now we continue. Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, why was Saul punished? In that he was ultimately led to commit the sins that were described yesterday and for which he was not able to make an atonement. Why did he come to commit those sins? Well, because at the very outset of his reign, of his reign as a monarch, he inappropriately gave up his royal honor. As it is stated with regard to Saul's inauguration, and this is 1 Samuel 10:27, and some base fellows said, how can this man save us? So they disparaged him and brought him no present, but he made himself as if he did not hear. Now this sounds like Saul should have been rewarded for being so humble, right? So at the time that he was set up to be the first king of Israel, which that he would always be forever, right? There was no other king before him, so he'll always be the first king of Israel. And at the time that he was being inaugurated, so everybody should have, made their obeisance, and if they were prominent people, sent a gift to the king. These base fellows did not send the gift, and Saul said, all right, whatever, I'm not going to worry about it, I'm not going to take offense. That sounds like a good and humble reaction when somebody doesn't pay you the respect you think you deserve. But there was a mistake on the part of Saul. Because it's all right to be humble and not stand on your honor when it's a matter just involving yourself. But Saul was now being given the role of the king of the nation. And an insult to the king is considered an insult to the nation. So he should not have let it go, as we learn. And it is stated immediately afterward, and Nahash the Ammonite marched up and encamped against Jabesh Gilead. Immediately after, right? One is 10:27 and then 11:1. And the implication is that if Saul had forcefully assumed his throne, Nahash would not have dared to attack the people of Jabesh Gilead. In this way, his humility led to the crisis. Because he seemed like a humble king who wasn't going to stand on ceremony, the neighboring kingdom said this guy's a weakling and chose that moment to attack the nation. So in not defending the honor of the crown, he caused harm to the nation. And Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, any Torah scholar who does not avenge himself and bear a grudge like a snake when insulted is not considered a Torah scholar at all, as it is important to uphold the honor of Torah and its students by reacting harshly to insults. Now, we can understand that a king who sort of doesn't stand on ceremony can cause harm to the kingdom. But a Torah scholar who's supposed to be the epitome of righteous, proper behavior, and who therefore should cultivate humility in his personality, he needs to bear a grudge when he is insulted, and not only bear a grudge, but bear it like a snake? Really? How is this possible? The Gemara asks, but isn't it written explicitly in the Torah, Leviticus 19:18, you shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people? And the Gemara responds, that prohibition is written with regard to monetary matters and not personal insults. As it was taught in a Baraisa, and we just covered this a few weeks ago, what is revenge and what is bearing a grudge? Revenge is illustrated by the following example. One said to his fellow, lend me your sickle. And he said, no. And the next day, he, the one who had refused to lend the sickle, said to the other person, lend me your axe. If he said to them, if the second one now says to him, I will not lend to you, just as you did not lend to me, that is revenge. And that violates a prohibition in the Torah. And what is bearing a grudge? If one said to his follower, lend me your axe, and he said, no. And the next day, the one who had refused to lend the axe said to the other man, lend me your robe. If the first one said to him, well, here it is, take the robe, as I am not like you, who would not lend to me. This is bearing a grudge, right? So taking revenge is treating somebody else in the same callous way that he treated you. Bearing a grudge is rising up a little bit and saying, well, you were wrong not to lend me the axe. I'm going to lend you the robe that you asked for because you need it, but I'm going to remind you that yesterday you were a jerk. That is bearing a grudge. That is also would violate a negative prohibition in the Torah. Although he does not respond to his friend's inconsiderate behavior in kind, he still makes it known to his friend that he resents the inconsiderate behavior. And this Baraisa shows that the prohibition relates only to monetary matters such as borrowing and lending, and perhaps not about insults. I recently saw some parts of the old Lisa Lampanelli video. She was an insult comic extraordinaire. Don Rickles comes to mind. But everyone knew that they were comedians just being mean in fun. But when somebody insults us to our face, it's difficult to put that aside. And now we're hearing, well, maybe it's not necessary to put aside when somebody insults you. You can bear some anger about that he insulted you personally. It's that, when it matters of buying and selling and lending and borrowing, etc., that's where perhaps we're not permitted to take revenge or bear a grudge. The Gemara asks, but does the prohibition against vengeance really not relate to matters of personal anguish suffered by someone? Is it really only in monetary matters? But wasn't it taught in a Baraisa? Those who are insulted, but do not insult others, who hear themselves being shamed, but do not respond, and those who act out of love for God, and who remain happy despite their suffering. About these people, the verse states in Judges 5:31, they that love him be as the sun when it goes forth in its might. Right? So one who just takes it when other people insult him and doesn't get flustered by it, just lets it go, right? They remain happy even though they've been insulted. They are like the sun. Now we understand why they're being compared to the sun, because in the story of the sun and the sun remained silent and ultimately prospered because of it. The moon complained and took offense, and the moon was diminished. Now, the Rebbe said that the moon ultimately got an opportunity for growth, which maybe even exceeded the sun, but, for a few billion years, the sun benefited by remaining silent. The Gemara responds that the prohibition against taking vengeance and bearing a grudge indeed applies to cases of personal anguish. However, actually, the scholar may keep resentment in his heart, though he should not act on it or remind the other person of his insulting behavior. And the Gemara asks, but didn't Rava say, with regard to whoever forgoes his reckonings with others for injustices done to him, the heavenly court, in turn, forgoes punishment for all his sins? Now that is a good motivation to just let it go. People have been mean to you. People have been cruel to you. Now, we're not talking about cases where somebody treated you with criminal malice and they are a danger to society. And of course, you have to, see to it that they get punished. So we remove that danger from society. But if somebody just insulted you in some way and you let it go, you forgive these wrongs done against you, then according to Rava, heaven looks down on that. And at the time that you're going to be judged, God says, well, just as this one forgave others, I will forgive him. Now, there's a good motivation for just letting it go. The Gemara answers, indeed, even a scholar who is insulted must forgive insults, but that is only in cases where his antagonist has sought to appease him, in which case he should allow himself to be appeased and forgive the insult. However, if no apology has been offered, the scholar should not forgive him in order to uphold the honor of the Torah. Now, the reason for all of this, the original idea that a Torah scholar should bear a grudge, and even like a snake, he should bear the grudge, meaning that it's not he as a person who was insulted. If it's just a private insult to him, even though he's a Torah scholar, of course he should let it go, certainly if the person comes and apologizes. However, if this is a prominent person and he is prominent for being a Torah scholar, and the insult or the offense is given publicly, all right, so now he stands for something greater than himself. Just like the king stands for the kingdom, the Torah scholar stands for the Torah. And we cannot brook offense to the Torah. And that is what it was being taught here. Now we go back to our Mishnah and the race for the job to clean the ashes off the altar. The Mishnah describes that the lottery between competing priests is conducted after they did away with the racing because of the injury that resulted. They went to a lottery. And what form did this lottery take? So it is conducted by the priests by extending their fingers for a count. And that way, the fingers are counted rather than the people. It's a subtle distinction, but it's an important one. We don't count Jews, but we can count Jewish fingers, as it were. So they put their fingers in to be counted. And the Mishnah elaborated, and what fingers do they extend for the lottery? They may extend 1 or 2 fingers, and priests do not extend a thumb in the temple. And the Gemara asks, now that the Mishnah states that the priest may extend 2 fingers, is it necessary to state that they may also extend 1 finger? And Rav Chisda said, well, this is not difficult. Here, when the Mishnah speaks of extending 1 finger, it is referring to a healthy person who has no difficulty extending just 1 finger. And without extending a second. There, when the Mishnah mentions 2 fingers, it is referring to a sick person, or we can imagine somebody with like a painful arthritis, something wrong with his hand, and it's difficult for him to actually extend just 1 finger. His other finger goes with it, so that person can extend 2 fingers. And so it was taught in a Baraisa, they may extend 1 finger, but they may not extend 2. In what case is this statement said? It is said in reference to a healthy person. However, a sick person may extend even 2 fingers, and the sick priests who sit or lie alone separately from the other priests extend 2 fingers, but their 2 fingers are counted as only 1. So it's not like the game we played in elementary school, the 21st finger is it, and you can extend either 1 or 2, depending on whether you feel lucky or how you're going to end up being counted. They just count, and it's a question, I don't know how they determine what number they're going to need to count to as all the priests are standing in a circle, and it's going to end up on whichever priest it is. Maybe there's a lottery for that. They start counting, and then they draw the number out of a hat. That tells them which number they're going to stop on. I'm not sure how that part of the lottery was conducted. We skip down just a little bit. It was taught in the Mishnah. An incident occurred where both of the priests were equal as they were running and ascending the ramp. So when they were doing this race up the ramp, and one of them shoved the other, and he fell, and his leg was broken. And the sages taught in the Tosefta, an incident occurred where there were 2 priests who were tied as they were running and ascending the ramp. And one of them reached the 4 cubits, within 4 cubits of the altar, which is the finish line. All right, so one of them reached the finish line before his colleague, and the one who lost the race was so angry that he took a knife and stabbed the winner in the heart. It's like ramp rage in the Holy Temple. Unimaginable. How could this have happened? These are the holy Kohanim who are charged with representing the nation and bringing our offerings to the Most High. And one of them became so jealous of the other because the other one won a race, which is going to land him the honor of cleaning the ash off the altar in the morning. And because this one lost a race, I guess in front of the other priests, and maybe that was a little part of this, he became so enraged that he killed the one who won the race. I mean, just unimaginable. And yet, I mean, tragically, we see this kind of stuff all too often, even today. People become enraged over completely inappropriate matters and resort to violence. So that is a story that, as we see, is not new to the 21st century. The Tosefta continues. Rabbi Tzadok then stood up on the steps of the entrance hall of the sanctuary and said, "Hear this, my brothers of the house of Israel." The verse states, this is Deuteronomy 21, 1 through 3. The verse states, "If one be found slain in the land, and it be not known who killed him, then your elders and your judges shall come forth, and they shall measure which is the nearest town to where this murder happened, this unsolved murder happened, where there's this body that's found and no one knows who killed him. So you measure to the nearest town, and it shall be that the city which is nearest to the murdered man shall take a heifer. They shall bring a cow as an offering. And the elders of that city took that heifer and broke its neck in a ritual of atonement. But what of us? This is Rabbi Tzadok still talking. But what of us in our situation? Upon whom is the obligation to bring the heifer whose neck is broken? Does the obligation fall on the city, Jerusalem, so that its sages must bring the calf? Or does the obligation fall upon the temple courtyards so that the priests must bring it? And at that point, the entire assembly of people burst into tears. Now, the law, it sort of doesn't make sense why Rabbi Tzadok is bringing it, because that's the case where you don't know who murdered the victim. There's just a body found out in the field. It's murdered, clearly, but the murderer got away with it. And so they go through this ceremony so that there's an atonement in the land, right? Because this unsolved murder, unpunished murder, is a blemish on the Holy Land. And in order to make an atonement on behalf of all the people in the land, the nearest town brings this atonement. But how does this apply here in our case where, okay, the priest who was murdered, we know murdered him, the priest who came in second in the race. So, we should just punish him. Why is it that we have to figure out, well, who brings the offering? Is it the priests in the temple or the sages of Jerusalem? We're going to come back to that question. The father of the boy, i.e., the young priest who was stabbed, came and found that he was still convulsing. So you can imagine the scene, right? The young priest who was running to try to be the one to shovel the ashes in the morning, he's lying there, he's still alive, he's been stabbed in the heart, and his father, who obviously is also a priest and who is serving at that time, because they serve by families, so he comes, he sees his son lying there bleeding with a knife in his heart, and the father said, "May my son's death be an atonement for you." For who? For the priests of the temple? For the people? But he didn't answer that. What he says is, "May my son's death be an atonement for you. But my son is still convulsing. He has not yet died. And as such, the knife, which is in his body, has not become ritually impure through contact with a corpse." Now, what knife is that? What knife was the priest who lost the race carrying that he had it handy so that he could immediately stab the one who he was jealous and angry with? It was the knife of a Cohen, a priest's knife, which is meant to be used only for slaughtering the animals that are brought as offerings on the altar. think of the sacrilege of using such a knife to kill a human being, and in particular another priest. So about this knife, which is a ritual knife used for slaughtering offerings in the temple, very special kind of knife. And so now the man whose son is lying there dying with this knife in his heart, the father says, this knife which is in his body has not become ritually impure through contact with a corpse because his son is still alive. So if you remove it promptly, it will still be pure for future use. Once his son dies, now the knife is inside a corpse, and it is made impure. It can't be used to to slaughter the offerings. But if it's pulled out now, then it's pulled from a living body, and it's not impure. But that knife is sitting in the boy's heart, so pulling it out will actually probably hasten his death. This incident comes to teach you that the ritual purity of utensils was of more concern to them than the shedding of blood. Even the boy's father voiced more concern over the purity of the knife than over the death of his child. Now you could say he's in shock and he's just trying to keep functioning, but that's what he said, rather than who killed my son? Why did this happen? God, why did this happen? He's talking about the knife. And similarly, it says, 2 Kings 21:16, furthermore, Menashe spilled innocent blood very much till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to the other, which shows that in the days of King Menashe as well, people paid little attention to bloodshed. Bloodshed had become so common at the time of this incident that they were more concerned about the purity of a ritual knife than of a murder most foul that had just occurred in the temple and a young priest who lay there dying. Now the Gemara asks, which incident came first? The one about the broken leg reported in the Mishna, or the one about the priest murdered in the Tosefta? If we say that the incident of bloodshed came first, well, this raises a problem. Now, if in response to a case of bloodshed, they did not establish a lottery, but continued with the running competition, can it be that in response to an incident of a priest's leg being broken, that they did establish a lottery? Rather, we must say that the case in which the priest's leg was broken in the course of the race came first, and as the Mishna states, the establishment of the lottery was in response to that incident. And the Gemara asks, but if the running competition was abolished immediately after the incident of the broken leg, and a lottery was instituted to replace it, well, once they established the lottery, what were they doing? Still running for the finish line in the incident that led to the murder of the young priest. Rather, actually, it is necessary to return to the first approach, that the case involving bloodshed happened first. Initially, the sages thought that it was merely a random, i.e. an isolated event. A terrible tragedy had happened, but it's so weird that we're not going to dictate new laws and new policy in the temple in response to it. This will never happen again. Because it was so unlikely that a murder would happen in that place. So they didn't abolish the competition due to that incident. But then, once they saw that in any event the priests were coming to danger because of the incident of the broken leg, as one of them was pushed and broke his leg, then the sages established a lottery. This is almost like, when does an intersection get a stop sign after there's been a certain number of car accidents? When does it get a traffic light? When there's been a death, right? Or maybe 2 deaths. So shouldn't we have just put the traffic light there right away? You would think so, but people also have to be administrators of the city and use their common sense. In light of recent tragic events, and that there had been causes for concern previously that were not addressed. Now there's been a tragic event. Presumably it will be addressed. But the way that kind of a process unfolds, I think this is, this teaching tonight, it's a good lesson. People who are in power, people who are entrusted with the safety of a community, on the one hand, they're always balancing values. On the one hand, you want everybody to be as safe as possible. On the other hand, if you overdo safety, you're going to limit freedom, and it can become excessive and tyrannical. So you're always trying to balance, right, safety and freedom, and it's a very difficult balance to achieve. And sometimes tragedies, help establish that, okay, this is what we have to do, but there shouldn't be two tragedies. The Gemara returns to the incident of the slain priest and discusses some details about it. It was related that Rabbi Tzadok stood up on the steps of the entrance hall of the sanctuary, and he said, "Hear this, my brothers of the house of Israel." And the verse states, "If one be found slain in the land," etc. But what of us in our situation? Upon whom is the obligation to bring the heifer, whose neck is broken? Does the obligation fall on the city, meaning Jerusalem, or does the obligation fall on the temple courtyards? The temple. And the Gemara asks, is Jerusalem subject to bringing a heifer whose neck is broken when there's a murdered body, and then in the mystery and the murderer can't be brought to justice? Is Jerusalem involved in that kind of a ritual? Wasn't it taught in a Baraisa? 10 things were said about Jerusalem to distinguish it from all the other cities in the land of Israel. And this is one of them. Jerusalem does not bring a heifer whose neck is broken. The reason for this is that the law of the heifer whose neck is broken applies only to land that was apportioned to a specific tribe of the Jewish people. Jerusalem alone was not divided among the tribes. It doesn't sit in the territory of one of the tribes, but rather, like Washington, D.C., and like some other kind of international cities, Jerusalem as the capital of the Holy Land is shared equally by the entire nation. Therefore, it's not treated like all the other cities in terms of if a corpse is found, murdered with an unsolved murder, and the nearest city is Jerusalem, the elders of Jerusalem don't bring the heifer whose neck is broken. And furthermore, it is written that the heifer whose neck is broken is brought when it be not known who killed the corpse that is found there. And here, in the case of the slain priest, it is well known who had smitten him. Rather, one must conclude that Rabbi Tzadok invoked the law of the heifer whose neck is broken, not because it actually applied in this case, but only to arouse the people's grief and to increase weeping. What is the whole idea of the heifer whose neck is broken? Somebody has to take responsibility for the tragedy that has happened, right? A murder happened in the land. Now, the first choice there is find the murderer, bring him to justice. Okay, they can't find the murderer. They find the body, there's no murder, they can't solve it. Somebody has to be accountable. And that's why the elders of the nearest town will come and they'll say, we take upon ourselves to bring an offering. Why? Because something terrible has happened in the land. There has been a murder, and we are all implicated, or at least we locally are all implicated in the conditions that produce the murder. We don't deny that there's evil and somebody evil committed this murder. But maybe we should have spotted the evil one earlier. Maybe we should have provided more protection. Something's rotten in our land, and we have to try to root that out. And so Rabbi Tzadok is saying, think what a big ritual and what a big to-do there is, when this unknown body is found somewhere out in the countryside, and they're going to go through this big ritual to find out which town is the nearest, and the elders have to bring the heifer and go through a big ritual. Now, a murder has happened in the temple compound itself, on the altar itself. Something's wrong with all of us. something's wrong with our nation. Something's wrong with the priesthood. Something's wrong with the way we're running the temple compound. That's what Rabbi Tzadok was saying. What kind of offering? Who's going to bring the offering? Who's going to take responsibility? Is it we priests are not running our affairs properly? Or is it the sages of Jerusalem who are telling us how to run things and they have told us something wrong? You know? And he's not really saying it's their fault, it's our fault. He's saying we need to take a reckoning. We need to we have to examine the way we're running things. And in that, he brought them all to tears. I'm almost done, so get your comments and questions in. By the way, I should have said at the beginning, Shavuos is approaching, less than 2 weeks, when we celebrate the giving of Torah at Mount Sinai. Accidental Talmudist is engaged in sharing Torah with the world, making authentic and sophisticated teachings 3,000 years old, time tested and proven, wisdom for living, making it accessible to all. If you love what we're doing, please support our work. And particularly what we're talking about right now is become a monthly donor. In any amount, it's beautiful. It allows us to have a more regular budget during the year. We have lots of expenses as a nonprofit. And we appreciate very much if you become a recurring donor. Nina will put that link in the comments, but it's donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. If you sign up to do $18 a month, then you can dedicate one of these shows to the healing or the honor or the memory of a loved one. When you think about what you spend $18 a month on, and when you think about the impact that $18 contributing to our nonprofit will have in terms of bringing Torah to so many people around the world, that's a big merit. And remember, whether you give to us or to other nonprofits, the money that you give to charity, to nonprofits for feeding people, clothing people, sheltering people, educating people, dowering brides, etc., and as our sages say, and teaching Torah is equivalent to them all. So that money is the only money you can take with you when you leave this world. You can't take possessions, but what you gave away for good causes, that's what you can actually take with you. Okay, Jerusalem does not bring a heifer whose neck is broken. And the reason for this is that the law of the heifer whose neck is broken applies only to the land. Wait a minute, did I not? I already said that. In relating the above incident, the Tosefta said, the father of the boy came and found that the boy was still convulsing. And he said, may my son's death be an atonement for you, but my son is still alive, etc. Now this incident came to teach us that the ritual purity of utensils was of greater concern to them than the shedding of blood. Right? That's what Rabbi Tzadok was saying. Let's examine our deeds. And we're more concerned about a ritual knife than this murder? Are we insane? How could we let this come? How could we have let it come to this state of affairs? A dilemma was raised before the sages. Should one conclude from this comment that bloodshed had become trivialized in their eyes, but their concern for the purity of utensils remained where it was originally, meaning that while they cared less than they should have about murder, they did not exaggerate the importance of the purity of utensils? Or perhaps their concern for bloodshed remained where it was originally, but their concern for the purity of vessels had become too exaggerated, to the extent that its importance was exaggerated beyond concern for human life. And the Gemara answers, come in here in answer to the dilemma, since the Tosefta adduces a biblical teaching from the verse, furthermore, Menashe, this wicked king, spilled innocent blood. Conclude from this that it was bloodshed that had become trivialized, and the importance of the purity of utensils had remained where it always was. The people had become desensitized to violence. Please God, and join me in praying that we never become desensitized to violence and to the bloodshed of our fellow human beings. We say amen. All right, let's go to comments and questions. Yosef. I could see the murder happening if jealousy was involved. Solomon writes in Proverbs that jealousy and envy are deadly. Yeah. Yeah. People become enraged. There was a video that came out just last night of a man, I think in New York somewhere, maybe in Brooklyn, beating another man to within an inch of the fellow's life. Over what? Over what? To put a beating like that? Lately, there have been these random attacks. It's been happening to Asian Americans. It's been happening to Jews. Just attacks out of nowhere for no reason. What the heck is going on? Please, God, help us as a society, as a nation, become more caring and more sensitive to violence, so that it doesn't appear as an option to people to resort to that kind of violence. It's like we really need some kind of perspective reset as a nation so that this stuff is not happening. I don't know how we get there, but the more light we put into the world, the better. Carolyn, what happened to the murderer in this case? Wasn't the law that the avenger of blood had the right to avenge? I mean, listen, he committed a murder in front of everybody. The punishment for that is going to be death, right? That was not the law of the avenger is more about an accidental kind of manslaughter situation. Now, you could say that does apply here because it wasn't a premeditated murder. He didn't wake up that morning and say, I'm going to go murder my fellow priest. He snapped. It was like some kind of moment of insanity. So maybe, yeah, the law of the avenger does happen. But that's only if he can get away, right, to one of the cities of sanctuary, so then the family can't, capture him. I don't know how they handled it. It doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us what the outcome of this incident is. Did they find some way to, excuse this guy? Did they give him the death penalty? I got to imagine at the very least they took away his priest privileges. But I don't know. I can't tell you what the answer is. Sharon, I find the extremes of treachery in these reportedly righteous men to be able to clean the altar so bizarre. Were these the only two incidents or examples of a more widespread problem? Now, these are the only two that I'm familiar of violence among the priests in a competition to, get the honors of the of having the avoda, different aspects of the divine service. They get quoted a lot, especially here in Tractate Yoma, about the laws of Yom Kippur, but elsewhere too, because it was such a horrific and kind of stand-out incident in its horror that they use it as an example of a lot of things. And particularly perhaps that the priests are entrusted to do all the priestly work, all the priestly functions, but they don't run the roost, as it were, right? The sages had authority over the priests because the priests, unless they're sages in their own right, and there were some sages who were also priests, but nevertheless, it was on the sages to determine, okay, what exactly does the Torah require from the priests? So the sages, the priests had to submit to the authority of the sages. The ones who did not submit to the authority of the sages were the Sadducees, as we have discussed elsewhere. And there was violence between the factions that followed the Sadducees and those that followed the Pharisees. But it was more than just jealousy and enmity for honor among the priests themselves. When we're talking about that factional fighting, now we're talking about power struggles that involve the monarchy and large numbers of people in the kingdom. And so there's more to it than just the jealousy among the priests themselves. And finally, PK, was the land so full of evil and corruption that these rules were made? Listen, eventually, the land and the temple became so filled with corruption that we did not merit for the temple to remain in our midst. And then the second temple was destroyed and it was not rebuilt, and it won't be rebuilt until Mashiach comes and the third temple is rebuilt. Presumably somehow, we will have reacquired that merit. Perhaps through all the suffering that we've endured, like we've been punished for that corruption, at length for 2,000 years. So if you ask my friend Rabbi Wolf, he says, "Oh no, we've paid the price, and we're like, It's like we've served this 2,000-year sentence, and right now we're standing at the outer door of the prison, with the key in the lock, and it's just like one more moment. It could happen any moment. That door will swing open. The Messiah will open that door, and we'll be, in a whole new world, right? When God's presence will be revealed throughout the world, etc. That's one view. Another, and a strong view, because we long for Moshiach every day. Another view is maybe the Messiah will be, he's going to come when he comes. He might come earlier if our merit as a people rises. Now, we paid a price as a nation with all the suffering in every generation, how we've been persecuted, murdered, tortured, genocided, the Holocaust, etc. But you also can't say that, all the Jewish people around the world are righteous all the time, right? I mean, we have to love our fellow Jews unreservedly and be there for each other. But we could, as a people around the world, there's room for improvement in our righteousness and in our service to Hashem. And if we would make that improvement, maybe Mashiach will come sooner. That's what I've got for us today. May we be blessed that we all rise in our midos, in our personal attributes, and we learn from terrible episodes like this in our history to conduct ourselves at a much higher level of righteousness, and through that righteousness and joy and taking care of one another and celebrating the blessings we receive constantly from the Holy One, may our merit rise, and to such a point that maybe Mashiach will come even sooner than the appointed time. And we say, Amen.